Welcome to those of you who are rolling in. We're going to give it just a couple of minutes so we can make sure that all of the attendees have moved from the waiting room into the webinar, and then we will get started. All right, I'll go ahead and get us started this evening. Welcome to the 2022 Diana E. Long Lecture, honoring path-breaking feminist scholar and beloved USM professor Diana E. Long. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Heather Shattuck-Heidorn, and her lecture is titled Gender and Sex Differences in Human Health, Insights from the COVID-19 Pandemic. Dr. Shattuck-Heidorn is an assistant professor of women and gender studies at the University of Southern Maine and the co-founder and assistant director of the Harvard Gender Sci Lab. She is also the former state refugee health coordinator for the state of Maine. Heather works at the intersection of public health, human biology, and social theory, focusing on how social constructs like gender, race, and class impact human well-being. Heather has extensive experience in quantitative research methods, community collaboration, and partnership building with a variety of stakeholders, as well as experience in leadership and team building. She is widely published, with her most recent work, Sex Disparities in COVID-19 Outcomes in the United States, appearing in the Journal of Social Sciences and Medicine. We are thrilled to have Heather here tonight to share this important groundbreaking work with us. Heather, I will pass it over to you. Take it away.
Thank you, Jen. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And hopefully this will all go smoothly. Okay, so you should all be seeing my screen now. I think that's probably true. And somebody will tell me if it's not. All right. So hi, good evening. Thank you, Jen, for that introduction. And first, I just want to say I'm really incredibly honored to be asked to give this lecture. And I'm really grateful to my colleagues at WGS for thinking of me for this, and then also for organizing this event and putting all the work into it to get things up and running, et cetera, as well as the other events during our Women's History Month programming. So as Jen said, my name is Heather Shattuck-Heidorn. I'm an assistant professor here of Women and Gender Studies at USM. I'm also a co-founder and assistant director of the Harvard Gender Sci Lab. And today I'm going to use some of my work at the Gender Sci Lab, especially in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, to illustrate larger points around how our concepts of gender and sex work in human health and biology. And you'll have to excuse me if you see me looking to the side, it's because I have another screen with my notes on it to the side. So sex differences are big news, right? Recent research, for instance, directly suggests, and then is popularly reported as, demonstrating that, among other things, women and men are different in their pain responses, in their brains, in their Alzheimer's risks, in their responses to common drugs, in cortisol levels, and in aspects of immune function. As a biologist, I'm interested in how we can understand sex differences and their causes. Almost universally, when sex-associated differences are found in health outcomes between women and men, these differences are viewed as innate, biologically driven, and even deeply related to evolutionary history. For some, when we measure biological outcomes, it can seem logical to turn to further biological underpinnings when examining the causes. But as I will argue in this talk, this leaves unconsidered a realm of social aspects of gender that can also influence biology. So first, before we dig into the substance of these questions, some definitions are in order. I'd like you to just take a moment and ask yourself for just a second, what is gender? And what is sex? What words would you associate with this? How would you explain these concepts, gender and sex, to a friend? All right, I'll give us all a second to get a working definition. And so it's pretty likely that you probably came up with some version of this definition. This particular one is offered by the NIH Office of Women's Health Research in 2016, and I'll let you go ahead and read this on your own. And I'll give you a little bit of background. So the terms sex and gender become distinct in the 1970s, with gender emerging as a way for the feminist movement to talk about the social roles of women and men, and sex becoming relegated to the biological essence, sort of maleness and femaleness. Before that, the term sex was used more fluidly to consider both how women and men lived their lives and were biologically. The use of gender to refer to social conventions and roles was useful. It allowed feminists to cleave the society they were analyzing from the realm of innate, predestined biology. But while gender is also sometimes used as a polite way to say sex. For instance, there are still animal studies that refer to the gender of male and female fish or rodents. Largely, the conventions set in place in this early time remain in use today, both in our common understandings of sex and gender in scientific research and in popular usage. For example, the above definition of sex and gender is given by the Office of Women's Health Research specifically to help guide scientists as to how they could consider these concepts in their research. So right now, as I begin this talk, I just want to take a second to note here that this definition of gender and my use of the word gender in this talk is not synonymous with gender identity or a person's own internal sense of their own gender. Later in the talk, I have a slide where I'm going to directly talk a little bit about the presence of trans people and gender diverse people within the data sets that I've been working with for the presentation that I'm giving. And I have several critiques of that. But for the moment, when I'm talking about gender, I'm not talking about gender identity. I'm referring to socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, etc. So this infographic accompanied the previous definition that the National Institutes of Health gave researchers who were interested in incorporating sex and gender in their research. And again, as are part of this guidance. So here they've outlined the male and the female form, and for various regions of the body, demonstrated sex, the blue text, and gender associated, the red text, risk factors that lead to health inequities between women and men. While sex here always has a biological consequence, the role of gender in health is limited in nearly all instances to the social perception and consequences of disease. Women as primary caretakers, and so the delay of treatment. Osteoporosis, being underdiagnosed in older men due to the perception of it as a women's disease. The sole clear example in this infographic of how gender can affect biology is the stereotypical example of the effects of women's wearing of high heels on knee arthritis. While the NIH argues elsewhere that of course gender can affect the body, in practice, when considering human health and biology, it seems that the conception of sex as biological and gender as cultural acts to limit the imagination. But we are at this exact moment living in the midst of what scholar Dorothy Roberts calls the new biosocial sciences. While we are often captured by innate, rather deterministic hypotheses related to apparent sex differences, scientists are recognizing the incredible capacious possibilities of biosocial hypotheses for understanding human biology in other domains. From the effects of poverty on the developing brain, to the physiological impact of structural racism, to how homophobia impacts the inflammatory system, we are recognizing that we are what Samantha Frost terms biocultural creatures. We live in a sort of constant give and take with our environment, both physical and social. So much of my work is focused on how we can better capture this give and take between our physical and social environments and our body. I focus on a set of questions around how we can better understand, conceptualize, theorize, and operationalize or put into practice gender and sex in the biosciences. Part of this is trying to understand, how do we understand apparent sex differences and counteract sex essentialist assumptions? Can we offer frameworks for researchers and policymakers to adopt? And then can we shift the conversation around sex, gender, and sex differences such that gender is viewed with the same complexity as we view other aspects of our social lives. So now, with this framework in place for our consideration of sex-associated disparities, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my work at the Harvard Gender Sci Lab in our analysis of COVID-19 cases and mortality. First, I'd like to stop and tell you a little bit about the lab itself, because it helps to frame our COVID-19 work. Formed in 2018 out of a decade-long collaboration between myself, Sarah Richardson at Harvard, and Meredith Righteous at UMass Boston, our lab primarily focuses on understanding how gender sex is modeled in the biosciences from both a theoretical and a methodological perspective. Our lab is really interdisciplinary. We have about 20 graduate students, postdocs, undergrads, and affiliated scholars. We have historians of science, epidemiologists, philosophers, biologists, psychologists, and others working side by side to understand the conceptualization and operationalization of gender, sex, and diverse domains. We have looked at issues of contemporary sperm quality, evolutionary hypotheses concerning innate gendered preferences, and our lab is also explicitly feminist. We're really explicitly aiming to counter bias and hype in the study of sex and to enhance public understanding and discourse surrounding the science of sex and gender. Often, when our lab works to contest the assumption in the biosciences that I just talked about, that biological outcomes that differ between women and men, with some examples including stress hormones, immune function, and disease states, have to be mediated by sex-linked pathways, such as those related to gonadal hormones, the 23rd chromosomes, or other aspects of innate sex. We also document how differences between sexes, assumed to be related to sex itself, such as Alzheimer's prevalence or drug metabolism, may be better accounted for by other variables, such as age and body weight. We argue that gender, as a multi-level intersectional variable, is generally under-considered in the biosciences and probably has pervasive effects on human biology. So that's the background of our lab. And then, as we all know, COVID happened. So in the spring of 2020, at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, our lab members, like everyone else, were thrown into the virtual environment, or like many of us, I suppose. As we know, many people had to continue going to work. Many of us found ourselves frantically grappling for childcare, or suddenly switching to teaching and learning online. And those of us in the lab, like everybody, were hyper-focused on the pandemic. As demographic data on cases and deaths began to emerge, it became clear that in many places, more men than women were dying of COVID-19. We watched as, in this new domain of COVID mortality, a familiar story began to take shape. Reports of sex disparities were often accompanied by causal claims that attributed them exclusively to innate sex differences. Estrogens, androgens, the Y chromosome, and deep evolutionary differences between men and women were all considered to explain the sex disparity in mortality rates. We were struck by the lack of engagement with the evidence for pre-existing and widespread gender-linked health differences between and among the categories of men and women. So here you can see just some of the headlines from this time period. Those early days of coronavirus, really like the first 9 months or so, were heady times in the world of sex differences. People were slapping estrogen patches on old men. They were, even recently, there were, I think Tucker Carlson suggested that people take the anti-androgens as a treatment for coronavirus. So the apparent sex difference in mortality was viewed exclusively through an innate sex-based lens. So here, before we go further, I'd like to just stop and have a quick little note on the use of language, men and women. In COVID, and indeed much of human biology and biomedical research, these categories are used in data collection without clarity as to whether they're referring to reported sex assigned at birth, gender identity, or even third-party assumptions. In my own work and in our work at the Gender Sci Lab, we've questioned the utility of these categories, both for understanding the variation present within human biology, but also for being able to understand biological outcomes associated with gender diversity. Here we have 3 pieces that we produced over the last year that challenge these binary and unclear data reporting practices. And these are all just directly in relation to COVID. I also have separately directly addressed my field to challenge the sort of myopic focus on a binary version of sex to understand human biology. But in the current work that I'm talking about, we're largely limited to understanding COVID cases and mortality as they are recorded in state and national level data. And so we use the categories as they are used in those data sets with a recognition of and a challenge to their limitations. So here we have a publication that we put out where we were talking about, it was a publication aimed, because again, we're trying to talk not just to academics, but to the public. It was a guide for journalists, public health people, et cetera, for how to communicate around COVID-19 and the sex disparities. We published in public health venues, arguing that we should collect more data on gender expansive people. And then I had an undergraduate student at USM who was absolutely fantastic, named Kai Jilson, who worked with me in the lab actually for Kai's entire senior year, and then Kai has stayed on in the lab working with us. And Kai interviewed 22 different state public health departments trying to drill down on what exactly they meant when they reported data by categories of male or female. And then we wrote together about what those categories meant in these data sets. So the data sets are really limited. We have a side goal or another goal of ours is to directly impact how we think about gathering data around sex. But for the meantime, the data is what we have. And what sex means, or what male and female means, varies quite a bit from state to state. Okay, so early on in the pandemic, we published some pieces aimed at giving light to contextual factors that were important to understanding the apparent increased mortality among men. We noted, for instance, that this was also seen in other coronavirus pandemics, but was later understood to be nearly completely accounted for by comorbidity, age, and sex differences in occupational exposure. Other work published at a similarly early time also challenged the idea that innate sex lay behind men's mortality. For instance, researchers examining all COVID deaths in Massachusetts found that the sex difference was not different than what was expected, given the pre-existing tendency for men to have greater mortality, largely due to differences in chronic conditions. To better understand the COVID-19 claims and data, we began tracking COVID-19 case and mortality rates by sex in the United States, manually collecting and updating the data weekly from state-level public health websites. Our data set became the first and the most comprehensive sex disaggregated breakdown of COVID-19 cases and mortality by state in the US. We made these data publicly available and contextualized by offering charts and figures examining the findings in relation to population size and age structure. Even in the early days of the pandemic, it was clear that the apparent sex difference was far from straightforward. The male to female mortality rate ratio varied widely across states and over time. For example, in New York, the initial wave of the pandemic had startlingly high mortality among men, yet nearby Connecticut had nearly equal male and female mortality. And then in New York, the high mortality of men quickly dropped. And from May 2020 onwards, the tracker demonstrated that the sex disparity in New York had greatly decreased in magnitude. And this is partly related to rural New York having COVID move into it, and the first wave being in the city. As the pandemic wore on, it also became clear that there were severe disparities across racialized groups in the United States that replicated pre-existing health disparities. Compared to white Americans, COVID-19 mortality rates could be close to 4 times higher among non-Hispanic Black Americans and up to 3 times higher among Hispanic or Latino Americans. Data and theoretical pieces laid out how these racial disparities were not due to innate biological susceptibility, but rather represented the effects of racism at the interpersonal, institutional, and structural levels. For instance, COVID-19 outcomes were patterned by social and structural factors, including racialized and economic segregation, crowded housing, and neighborhood poverty level. However, no reports examined how mortality varied by sex within race, or how the apparent sex difference in mortality varied across race. Motivated by the importance of further understanding the clear racial disparities and the apparent sex disparity, we collected all available US state level data that would allow us to conduct a sex by race analysis. We hypothesized that if there is a strong sex-driven biological contributor to the apparent sex disparity, there should be relatively similar sex differences across social groups. Conversely, if the reason for the sex difference is largely due to social factors, we would expect to see quite a lot of variation in the sex difference between social groups. Based on results of previously cited analyses, we expected that Black Americans would have higher COVID-19 mortality than white Americans, but we did not know what analyzing the race by sex mortality rates would reveal. Our results were stark. We found that Black men had much higher mortality rates than any other race or sex group, revealing a particularly vulnerable subgroup. But contrary to the common story of men as uniquely vulnerable, Black women had 3 to 4 times the mortality rate of white men or Asian and Pacific Islander men. And here, I gotta move you guys so I can wiggle the graph. So here, I'll just talk you through this graph real quick before I explain the rest of the results. So here is Georgia and Michigan. We have Asian Pacific Islander individuals here, Black individuals here, white individuals here, and then here again are the same categories. The lighter colored bar is men, the darker colored bar is women. So here, these are all COVID mortalities in these states as a year into the pandemic. So here, you can see that no matter where you are, Black men have the highest mortality rate, but then Black women have higher mortality rates than white men or Asian Pacific Islander men, and the same is true in Georgia. We also found that the sex disparity in the mortality ratio varied widely between racial groups. The mortality difference between Black men and Black women, so here's Black men and Black women, here's Black men and Black women. So the difference between them was much larger than the corresponding sex disparity among white men and white women, or among Asian Pacific Islander men and Asian Pacific Islander women. So here in Michigan, for instance, you can see that there's quite a large sex disparity among Black individuals, and then a much smaller sex disparity among white individuals. If you're familiar with error bars, you can see that this difference is not actually statistically significant between the Asian individuals. And then again, to a slightly lesser degree, a similar story in Georgia, where you have a larger sex difference among Black individuals than you do among white or Asian individuals. Additionally, our analysis revealed significant racial disparities within sex. So here, I want to point out that within sex disparities. So for instance, comparing Black women to Asian Pacific Islander women or white women, and then here comparing Black women to Asian Pacific Islander women or white women. We actually showed that the difference in mortality between Black and white women was nearly 4 times greater than the sex disparity between white women and white men. So now I'm comparing this difference from here to this difference within sex. For us, the magnitude of the variation that we see here in the sex disparity between racialized groups, as well as the fact that Black women had much higher mortality than white or Asian men, as well as the magnitude of the variation within sex, gives evidence that while there may be some link to innate sex operating in this disparity, social and contextual factors are likely driving the mortality differences. There we go. So understanding these patterns, and particularly the extremely high death rates of Black men and women, requires consideration of how social factors interact with gender and race to shape COVID-19 disparities. So our paper was directly premised very clearly that we do not consider race as representing genetic differences, but rather historical and ongoing oppression of communities and individuals based on racial category. And similarly, social context likely plays a critical role in the observed sex differences in COVID-19 mortality rates. This is not to say that there is not some aspect of innate sex. Perhaps lifelong exposure to estrogen is somehow slightly protective of from COVID-19. Perhaps testosterone exposure is somehow related to COVID-19 outcomes. But it is to say that whatever is going on with innate sex, the evidence is that social factors are capable of completely dwarfing it. So these are just a few of the social factors that are associated with gender and race that have patterned how both exposure and susceptibility to the coronavirus. We know that Black men and women, along with Latino men and women, though our data could not investigate that because of the population, like the sample size for the Latino category, we had to drop the data from the analysis. We know that they're overrepresented in industries like transportation, service workers, and healthcare workers, often industries that were considered essential workers and could not work from home and had high exposure risks to COVID-19. This and other examples, such as neighborhood segregation and housing density, are one, influenced by historical and contemporary racism and discrimination in employment industries, and two, affect the risk of exposure to COVID-19 during the pandemic. Other factors affected people's susceptibility to COVID given an exposure. For instance, chronic diseases are a well-established risk factor for poor COVID-19 outcomes. Chronic disease patterns in the US often mirror the patterning of data that we saw for COVID-19 outcomes. And chronic diseases are obviously multifactorial in terms of causes, but there are clear linkages between healthcare access, discrimination, and racism in the medical care industry, and societal factors affecting the ability to exercise and eat healthy foods, such as poverty or neighborhood factors. In our analyses of the interaction between race and sex and COVID-19 outcomes, we outlined how factors such as these could influence the patterns we observed, drawing on well-established bodies of theoretical and analytical work exploring how gender and race as social constructs impact health and experience in the United States. So here I'd like to take a minute to discuss how we see our work situated theoretically. So we used, in this particular paper, we used intersectionality to approach this analysis. So intersectionality is a critical analytical lens developed within Black feminist theory, though the foundational work of scholars like Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw, though drawing on an extensive and deep history of such analyses within the writings of Black women and Black feminist scholars. A key tenet of intersectionality is a commitment to the analysis of how oppression is linked to social categories, differently structures experiences, such that the experience of being, say, Black and a woman in a racist and sexist society is not simply the additive experience of being Black plus being a woman, but is qualitatively distinct and has different outcomes. Intersectionality emerged in the social sciences and within critical legal theory. However, there's increasingly calls to incorporate it as a framework within the biomedical sciences. There's been serious scholarly debate on this issue. For one, the biomedical sciences are not usually well placed to analytically consider societal oppression and power dynamics, and often have a reluctance to do so, or even have actively dismissed scholarly work from fields that are skilled in these analyses. For us, the statistical consideration of how race and sex quantitatively interact does not make the prior piece intersectionality in practice. Rather, it's our framing and discussing our analyses, we consider several aspects of societal power dynamics that may underlay the patterns we observe. For us, it's this contextualization that causes us to consider this as an example, a possible example of intersectionality in practice in the biosciences. So our analysis of COVID-19 outcomes from race and gendered categories demonstrated the extreme variability of the apparent sex disparity. To further understand how the apparent sex disparity varied, in spring of 2021, we analyzed more than a year of data from our COVID tracker. While the data were limited in our ability to analyze outside of simple gender-sex category, we were interested in what our data would tell us regarding how case and mortality rates varied over place and time. We found that throughout the pandemic, the sex differences in COVID rates vary widely. Often, women had higher case rates than men, meaning that more women than men were receiving positive tests for coronavirus, possibly due to their concentration in frequently tested industries, such as healthcare workers, but also possibly due to exposure or to willingness to test. Many states resembled Louisiana, with women having slightly higher case rates throughout the pandemic. However, there were states with little difference in case rates, such as Michigan, or even in which men had much higher case rates, such as Texas. The sex disparity in the case mortality rate, while nearly always higher in men, also varied quite widely. In a few states, men and women had nearly equal mortality rates throughout the pandemic. In others, men had starkly higher mortality rate right from the beginning. In still others, the disparity emerged later in the pandemic. So here we have Massachusetts, in which men and women have nearly equal mortality rates all along. We also have California, in which a mortality difference develops over the course of the pandemic. And then you see Texas, in which right from the beginning, men have higher mortality rates. The tendency of women to have higher case rates becomes important when considering the higher case fatality rate of men. If through concentrations in industries like healthcare and education that mandate testing, women had a higher percentage of mild or asymptomatic cases diagnosed, this would decrease their case fatality rate. And indeed, we have a master's student who's applying to PhD programs right now named Annika Gompers, who's really brilliant. And she has a paper coming out that it analyzes just this idea, whether or not the case fatality rate is an inaccurate example of a sex difference if it's in the context in which one sex has higher likelihood of testing. So the variation in the sex disparity in mortality that I was just discussing is also evident if we consider data across the US. So I know this figure is super busy, but I'm gonna walk us through it. So overall, there is a male bias in the mortality rate ratio from COVID-19. On average, men had higher mortality than women. You can see that most of the lines here are above 1. Each line in this graph, by the way, okay, so each of these gray lines is a state. And then on the left-hand side, you have May 2020. And on the right-hand side, you have May 2021. And you have data weekly for each state over this time period. So you can see that so at 1, this is male to female rate ratio. So at 1, it would be an equal. This is when men and women have equal mortality rates from COVID. Anything below 1 is where women actually have a slightly higher mortality rate at that point in time. Anything above 1 is when men have a higher mortality rate. You can see that throughout most of the pandemic, on average, men have higher mortality than women. This is visually demonstrated because most of the lines are above 1.0, which is when men and women have equal mortality rates. However, there's significant variation in the mortality rate ratio, not only over time, but also between place. So here, each gray line is a state. Oh, here, I explain it in my words, good. The black line here is the average. Some states are nearly always at a high rate ratio. Consider Texas, the orange line, which often has a rate ratio near 1.5. And while on average, the rate ratio is above 1, we can see that some states, like Connecticut, the green line, frequently have rate ratios below 1, indicating that women had a higher mortality rate than men at those times. Rate ratios also changed over time. And so earlier I mentioned how New York had a different scenario happening in the sex disparity at the beginning of the pandemic versus the end, or after the first wave. So here's New York, the blue line. And here at the beginning of the pandemic, it has a starkly high male mortality rate. It's above 1.5. And this is one of the points in time when people were like, wow, there's a lot of men dying of COVID right now. However, as the pandemic wore on, deaths in New York became at times more equalized between men and women. So you can see that it begins to climb towards the end. And what happens here, what we know happens here is that after the initial wave in the city, the pandemic moves into more rural New York. And then you have more equal mortality rate ratio between men and women. So overall, work from our lab has demonstrated that the gender sex disparity in the COVID-19 in COVID-19 cases and mortality varies between racialized groups, varies across time, and varies between places. Gender-related factors that might contribute to the observed heterogeneity and patterns of the sex disparity include gender-linked health behaviors and occupational exposures, which can intersect with other socially salient variables, such as race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status. So gender influences both exposure to the virus and susceptibility to severe outcomes, such as mortality. Occupational work segregation or adherence to behaviors such as mask wearing mediates viral load and therefore disease severity. Chronic diseases, which are differentially distributed across men and women, both due to gender and sex-related factors, are also important contributors to COVID-19 progression and outcomes. As emphasized by our analysis of sex and race in COVID-19 outcomes, a more nuanced and accurate picture of risks emerges from analyses of interactions between variables, such as sex and race, as opposed to unidimensional analysis of these social variables. In all, what we have found with COVID-19 has ended up being a familiar story. An outcome was biological in nature. In this case, virus case rates and mortality. Though we have a paper forthcoming examining, actually that came out. We have a paper that came out that examines the actual immune response in COVID, and I can talk about that as well. Because the outcome differed between the sexes, and was biologically measured, innate sex was presumed to be the primary, if not sole, causal factor. Instead of a reductive approach, mistaking differences between women and men to be mediated primarily by sex, our approach to COVID-19 sex disparities embraces an understanding of SARS-CoV-2 as a biological agent embedded in social context. Our data do not prove that sex biology has no role in COVID-19 outcomes, nor do we prove here that social factors underlay the patterns we observe, but it does discredit single factor approaches that are not sensitive to contextual variation. In part, the purpose of our lab is to investigate and analyze such claims around human sex and gender, and to offer conceptual and methodological frameworks to the biosciences to practice better modeling of gender and sex as a biosocial force. Despite increased recognition of how biosocial factors such as poverty or racism act on human biology, COVID-19 demonstrates that for gender, such a perspective continues to be sorely needed. And then I'd like to talk just a little bit about some of my work here at USM and future work. So moving forward, things that we're interested in both in the lab, but then also in my own work, is understanding how we can better operationalize gender. So we can see, we can sort of infer the presence of gender in the data that we looked at through this talk. Other projects that I have going right now are examining large pre-existing data sets, which is basically what the COVID work does. And it asks whether we can somehow account for the structural impacts of gender, maybe through creating metrics that incorporate examination of laws that relate to gender, maybe background prevalence of religious beliefs, and here I draw inspiration from some people doing work like this in sociology, or even gender-related outcome variables such as employment disparities, income disparities, and health disparities. Other projects that I'm interested in are how gender can be better incorporated into pre-existing surveys. For instance, there's many large data sets that have these early life stress surveys. And so in the early life stress surveys, often researchers ask a set of questions related to stressful experiences that one can experience in early life. Some of you may know these as ACEs surveys, but they don't have to be ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. They can be, there's a lot of different early life stress surveys. And anyways, your answers to them or the participants' answers gets added up and usually turned into, say, a 1 to 10 measure, and then however each item gets a score. And what we usually find with these is that women are more sensitive to the way it's framed is that women are more sensitive to stress than men are. So let's say a woman scores a 5 on this early life stress survey and a man scores a 5, they have women are more likely to develop depression and anxiety or PTSD and things like that in relation to these early life stressors. But the items in these scales are they're all equally weighted usually. And they're not equal items, and they don't equally affect women and men. So some things like physical punishment tends to affect boys slightly more. Other things affect boys and girls equally, like having a parent in jail. Other things tend to affect girls much more than boys, such as being sexually abused. And so it's possible that the lifelong stress effects of, say, being sexually abused is not equally weighted with things like having a parent in jail, and that the way that we're measuring stress is not taking into account gender-specific sources of stress and how that then may mediate your response to later life exposures. And so when we look at the difference between depression and anxiety in women and men, we often, again, turn to, in this instance, people usually propose evolutionary explanations on some level, or they often propose it, proposing that women are, say, like women and men have different responses to stressors. In human evolutionary biology, people say, well, men are fight or flight and women are tender befriend, right? And so women have this like anxiety response to social stressors, while as men like want to fight it. And partly that those hypotheses and are drawing off of things like differences in later life anxiety upon exposure to early life stress. So I'm interested in how gender can be better considered as its own domain within existing work. And then I also am looking forward. COVID really threw a monkey wrench in this, and then honestly, I had a baby, and that throws a monkey wrench in too. But I'm really looking forward to opening smaller community-based studies. Although I had a baby the last time I did community-based work, and it was fine. I just brought him with me everywhere, and people love babies. It's like a cheat code for community-based work because everybody really likes babies. A lot of people like babies. So in smaller community-based studies, which I hope to start running soon, I'm interested in how we can operationalize and measure the impact of gender and gender identity and sexuality. So here I would loop in other domains on health and biology for groups of people. I'm interested in what this would look like, how you could do it in a way that didn't sort of position trans people or gender diverse people as like uniquely different from other people. So I'm particularly interested in understanding right now gender identity within cis people and how cis people do things to change their bodies, to make their bodies in more accordance with their gender identity. But then also how stress and social support matter for health and biology for, say, LGBTQ youth, where we know that these things matter and we know there's later life health effects, and we're missing some of the mechanisms. So for me, operationalizing gender in these small studies, where in the big studies, I sort of am limited to what people have already made and built. But in the smaller studies, it's a chance to ask, what would we like this to look like? And for instance, how conceptually, when we think about how to operationalize gender, does it compare to metrics that we have in use for things like racism or poverty? I think that one of the big differences with gender is that it's not primarily necessarily stress-based. There are, of course, stress-based aspects of gender, and I just mentioned a couple of them. But there's other aspects of gender and gender performance and gender, how we experience gender and interrelational parts of gender, that really stress is not I would argue, like not the framework with which to view this. Whereas for poverty and racism, psychosocial stress is often the primary framework that's used to understand how it mediates things within human biology. So, okay, that's what I've been up to for the last year or two. This is where I'm going next. If you happen to be a student at USM and you would like to get involved in this research, please let me know. I'm always open to talking to students, and I've just been blown away. I am a former USM, I'm a student of USM myself. I got my bachelor's degree here, and I knew we had great students, and I've just been delighted with the students that I've worked with, and you're welcome to shoot me an email. And that is it. I just want to thank my collaborators at the Gender Sci Lab. Obviously, I just presented like a huge amount of data. That's only possible through this like powerhouse collaborative team that we've built there. And I really appreciate my colleagues. I also appreciate that the data tracker that we had, that I presented a lot of data from, was updated weekly by a team of primarily undergrads. And Kai Jolson here, again, appearing as a superstar, is from USM, but we also had undergrads from Harvard, I think from Duke, and then maybe one non-undergrad that was just an associated scholar. Anyways, super collaborative work. I really appreciate all the help that I get from the lab. And then I have these are citations for work that you just saw. And then I have references for things I randomly said, if you're interested. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Heather, for that really informative and interesting discussion. We have some questions and answers rolling in. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A and I will kind of go through as they come in. Our first question posed by Mark has to do with race. He asks, race, is it defined by self-identity, or other observation? And kind of building off of that, people who are trans taking estrogen or testosterone, what is their sex gender mortality rate in this conversation?
So race in these data sets is, it's probably defined by self-identity. And again, it's going to vary from place to place. So it could be like gender, sex gender, in which it was defined in many different ways, but my guess is defined by self-identity. But I don't know that for sure. It's the public health reported data from the states. And then we don't have that data for trans people. So part of the reason that we've argued for better data on during the pandemic on gender diverse people is that we have a lot of data on how gender diverse people experience the pandemic. So we know that people's access to care was interrupted. We know that people found various strategies for coping with like living with hostile family members. We know that many people were able to resume care during the pandemic. So we have data on, not us, but scholars have data on how trans people fared during the pandemic. But to my knowledge, I've never seen any data on whether trans people taking estrogen and or testosterone androgens and or other associated like blockers or et cetera. I haven't seen anything about their COVID-19 responses. I don't think we have that data. Like the grand we.
Another question also from Mark has to do with anti-vaxxing attitudes. Mark asks, what may be a relationship of anti-vaxxing attitudes to mortality rate? Is there any association?
I don't actually have personal data from that. I could give you like my take on it, but I can't. I don't think it would be like that. That's not what I can't address it from this work.
All right, thanks. Our next question is from Kim Simmons. Kim would like to know if there's data on infection rates in caregiving relationships such as parenthood, the age of children and grandchildren, and also if there are predictions on how this might play out with caregiving going forward.
So that's a good question, Kim. And what I have seen is evidence that multi-generational households had higher infection rates and therefore higher mortality rates among populations that were living in multi-generational households. So I have seen that evidence. And so, and that relates to some of the racial differences that you can observe in the US, because some populations are more likely to be living in multi-generational households, and particularly among immigrant communities, but also among other communities as well. And then I don't think I have any predictions on how anything will play out related to how with caregiving going forward. I still have a kid that like occasionally has to stay home up from daycare for 10 days. So I have no idea how we're this far into the pandemic and we seem to have no solution to caregiving responsibilities and being balanced with the rest of life in the pandemic.
All right, our next question is from Wendy. In looking at New York, is the argument that the early sex disparity and death by COVID was because the early deaths were in New York City, which has greater racial diversity than more rural parts of the state? That is an intersection between race and gender.
Yeah, I don't think there's, we can't say that for sure. Like, I don't have the data to conduct an analysis that would let me say that. But yes, I think that's a strong hypothesis for what's happening there, is that early in the pandemic, you also have greater exposure possibilities within the city. You have this, like, we get into these like housing density things. We get into talking about, people being unable to isolate in the same way that they can in other areas. But yes, 100%. It's also, I think, because of the racial and ethnic differences between New York City and the rest of the state, other areas of the state.
Great, thank you. Autumn Green would like to know if Hispanic groups are accounted for in the data.
So not in our data because of the numbers at the time for the states that we were working with. I mean, there are, in the big data that I showed, like the many different lines data, there are all ethnicities or racial categories that are in the US are in those data sets. They're not separated out, but you can't see any information on it. And so for Hispanic groups overall, the information that I've seen, and actually states were really, we have another project that I didn't get into where we tried to poke public health state public health departments into giving better data through publishing. Like, I showed the piece that we published on, like, I forget, it was like titled something like fairly inflammatory, like aggressive. It was like better data on gender diverse people now or something. I forget what we titled it, but we also had a piece where we created these report cards where we graded states on their data availability and how many interactional variables they were reporting. And it really didn't, like, nothing really changed over the course of the pandemic. I think because state public health departments are under many different constraints, and the way that data is reported is so heterogeneous for the United States. Anyways, most places did not have data available, even at the end of the pandemic, that would let you do analyses that tried to understand things like the sex disparity or the racial disparities, or even how these related to other factors like age, etc. So in places that did have separate data, we see that depending on the place, Hispanic or Latino groups fare poorly compared to white and Asian groups. And then where they fall in line with, say, African American groups or Native American groups sort of depends on the state. It depends on the place. There was somebody in a public health department that sent us an analysis they did on city level data down in Texas. I'm remembering this right now. And in their city level data from Texas, where they had data from 2 big Texas cities, and they did have ethnicity and sex. And they showed the same thing that we saw in between, basically, they also showed that his Latinos had higher mortality rates than whites, and that the sex difference varied widely between groups. So they showed again that the sex difference itself is somewhat unstable, that while there is a tendency for more men than women to die, what that means in absolute mortality rates varies quite widely, and the sex difference itself can be very large or very small, indicating that social factors are likely playing into this.
Julianne would like to know, what would be your advice on best public health policies to address COVID spread based on your research? How would you like to see the response change?
That's a good question. I really focused a lot on what I could do with the data that was being gathered and what data I wanted gathered. And then I feel like COVID is such a moving target in some ways. Like the response to COVID seems like a moving target to me. And there's like, I think like if I could make a response to this now, and I don't know that that would have been my response to the same question 6 months ago, or certainly the 6 months before that. I have gone personally stepping outside of my researcher role. I have gone from both writing long emails to my superintendent talking about how they shouldn't bring kids back to school in August 2020 to writing emails to the PTO and my school board people telling them that I wanted the mask policy removed. So I think the evidence landscape has changed a lot with COVID over the course of the pandemic. I have made personal assessments of that evidence landscape. One of the assessments that I made is that I don't think most young children are at risk of COVID. And I definitely don't think that there's any evidence that masking kids does much at all. Masking young kids, like elementary school kids. This is different than high school kids. There's like the evidence changes, but I don't think there's evidence from some countries didn't mask young kids and it doesn't seem to matter. The cloth masks don't seem like they're doing anything for young kids, aside from like wearing a mask, but they don't seem like they're either A, effective at preventing COVID spread if you have somebody sitting in a classroom next to somebody else for 8 hours wearing a cloth mask, or B, that young kids are that effective at spreading it. And then, so that's where I am over the last 6 months. A year and a half ago, I felt like there was not good enough data at all to be bringing kids even back to school. Despite the frankly hell that my life was when my kids were out of school. So I don't know I don't think I would give public health advice because I would have to really dive into it to give advice right now because the evidence landscape changes so frequently. And so I would say I would just trust the people that are living in that evidence landscape and also recognize that COVID itself has shifted over the last 2 years. Like we don't have the same COVID as we had 2 years ago, and our data landscape has shifted. Like 2 years ago, we didn't have data on what happened in schools. We didn't have data on how effective certain interventions were. So I'm trying to stay abreast of data related to that as it comes out, while also keeping my sanity level, because you can't just like live in COVID data. That's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Heather. It is 5 o'clock. We're rounding into the next, or I'm sorry, it's 6 o'clock. I'm in Central Time right now, so it is 1 hour behind for me. But thank you so much, Heather, for sharing your research with us, for answering all of these questions. It was an honor and a privilege for us to have you be our Diana E. Long Lecturer this year for the spring of 2022. And thank you to all of our attendees for coming to listen to Heather's talk.
It was a real honor to be asked, and I really appreciate it. And thank you for having me.
Thank you.